Marta Backwood was 67 years old the day she stood on the sidewalk of a town she had never visited, staring at a building that looked like it had been waiting to die. Peeling paint hung from the clapboard siding in long curls, like skin after a sunburn. The wraparound porch sagged at both corners, and the front steps were missing their third and fifth boards entirely. 2 of the upstairs windows were boarded shut. The rest stared back at her, clouded and vacant, like the eyes of someone who had given up a long time ago. If you have ever inherited something you did not ask for, something heavy, something broken, something that everyone else had already walked away from, then you already know what Marta felt in that moment. Not excitement, not gratitude, just the quiet, exhausting weight of being the last person left. But here is what Marta did not know yet. She did not know that this crumbling boarding house on the narrowest street in Graywater, Virginia, was about to change her life in ways she could not have imagined. She did not know that behind those locked doors upstairs, behind the dust and the silence and the peeling wallpaper, there were stories that had been buried for decades. Stories of women who had nowhere else to go. Stories of survival. Stories of dignity clinging to existence by its fingernails. And she certainly did not know that within a year, a wealthy investor would be standing on this same sidewalk, red-faced and furious, demanding she sell the property, and that she would look him in the eye and say no. But wait, we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before you hear how Marta Backwood rebuilt the house that rebuilt her, you need to understand how she ended up here in the first place. Because Marta did not arrive in Graywater as a woman of means. She arrived as a woman who had spent 40 years making herself small so that others could feel large. Marta Backwood, born Marta Ellison, had been a promising social work student at the University of Richmond in 1978. She had written her senior thesis on transitional housing for women leaving domestic violence situations, and her professors had encouraged her to pursue a graduate degree. She was sharp, organized, deeply empathetic. She had the kind of mind that could hold 100 details and still see the whole picture. Then she married Gerald Backwood. Gerald was a regional sales manager for a furniture distribution company. Handsome, confident, the kind of man who always seemed to know where the best table in the restaurant was. He told Marta, 3 weeks after the wedding, that her career ambitions were admirable, but impractical. They were starting a family. Someone had to manage the house, the appointments, the meals, the in-laws, the social calendar. Someone had to make sure his shirts were pressed before every conference. Someone had to remember every birthday, every anniversary, every parent-teacher night. That someone was Marta. For 38 years, she raised 2 children, Kevin and Laura. She cooked over 14,000 dinners. She managed every move, and there were 6 of them, each time to a bigger house in a better neighborhood, because Gerald's career kept climbing. She entertained his colleagues, organized his files when he brought work home, proofread his reports when his assistant quit. When Gerald's mother developed dementia in 2003, it was Marta who drove 40 minutes each way, 3 times a week, to sit with her, feed her, wash her hair, read to her from the same magazine she'd already read aloud 17 times. Gerald visited once a month. At the funeral, he gave a speech about the importance of family. She was the invisible architecture of his entire professional life. She was the one who remembered that his boss was allergic to shellfish, that the Henderson account required a follow-up call every quarter, that his blood pressure medication needed refilling on the 15th. She tracked school schedules and dentist appointments and oil changes and property taxes and holiday cards for 63 people every December. Gerald never once said thank you. What he said, regularly, was this: "Marta, I don't know what you do all day, but the house never seems to get any cleaner." What he said was, "I'm the one who works, Marta. Let's not pretend otherwise." What he said when she once suggested she might take a part-time position at the county social services office was, "And who exactly is going to run this household?" What he said at a dinner party in front of 12 people when someone asked what Marta did was, "She keeps herself busy." Keeps herself busy. Her social work textbooks had stayed in a box in the garage for the first 10 years. Then they moved to the attic. Then, during the 4th relocation, Gerald told her to throw them out. "You're not going back to school, Marta. Be realistic." She kept 2, and inside a box labeled Christmas decorations. Fragile. She never opened them, but she never threw them away. 38 years of keeping herself busy. When Gerald died of a heart attack at 69, alone in a hotel room during a sales conference in Atlanta, Marta expected to feel grief. Instead, she felt a strange, disorienting emptiness, like stepping into a room that had been cleared of all its furniture. The shape was familiar, but nothing was where it should be. Gerald's will was straightforward. The house went to Kevin. The investment accounts went to Laura. Marta received a monthly allowance of $1,400 from a modest annuity, the old Subaru station wagon, and a handwritten note from Gerald's attorney informing her that Gerald had always intended to ensure her comfort in a manner proportionate to her contributions. Proportionate to her contributions. Kevin called from Denver 3 days after the funeral. "Mom, I know this is a lot, but Laura and I have been talking. We think you should downsize, maybe a senior community, something manageable." Laura called from Chicago an hour later. "Mom, Kevin's right. The house is too much for you. We can help you find something small. You'll be fine." Neither of them asked what she wanted. Neither of them asked about her plans, her thoughts, her grief. They had inherited Gerald's certainty that Marta's preferences were irrelevant, a minor administrative detail to be resolved so that more important matters could proceed. Kevin had already contacted a real estate agent. Laura had already researched assisted living facilities. Fine. That was the word everyone used. She would be fine. Fine in a 1-bedroom apartment with beige walls and fluorescent lights and a community room where strangers played cards on Tuesday afternoons. Fine, meaning small, quiet, out of the way, costing nothing, bothering no one. Marta sold the house. It was in Kevin's name, of course. So the proceeds went to him. She packed what fit into the Subaru. She drove away from the life she had built for 4 decades, and she did not cry. She did not cry because she had learned, over 38 years, that crying was something Gerald found irritating. And even though Gerald was dead, the habit of silencing herself was still alive. She was 66, alone, with $1,400 a month, and no professional credentials that had been valid since 1978. And then the letter arrived. It came from an attorney in Graywater, Virginia, a town Marta had never heard of. A distant cousin on her mother's side, a woman named Hazel Timmons, had died at the age of 91, leaving behind no children and no spouse. Her sole remaining property, a boarding house at 14 Elm Street, had been willed to the nearest living relative. That relative was Marta. The attorney's letter was brief and apologetic. The building had been unoccupied for over a decade. The town had no particular interest in it. There were back taxes owed, $2,300, and the property was in what the attorney politely called a state of significant deferred maintenance. He recommended she sell it to a local buyer, settle the taxes, and move on. Marta drove to Graywater in March. The town sat along a slow river with a main street of 11 buildings, a hardware store, a diner, a post office, a church, a funeral home, and 6 others in various states of occupancy. Elm Street ran perpendicular to the river, narrow and tree-lined, and the boarding house stood at the dead end, 3 stories tall, with 12 windows across the front and a porch that wrapped around both sides like arms trying to hold the building together. She turned the key in the front door and pushed. The smell hit her first, dust and damp wood, and something sweeter underneath, like dried lavender that had been sitting in a closet for 20 years. The entrance hall was wide, with a staircase on the right and a row of brass hooks on the left wall, each one labeled with a small nameplate. She leaned closer and read them. Agnes, Dolores, Mr. Kaczynski, Ruth and Child, Teachers, Room 4. She climbed the stairs. The hallway on the second floor had 6 doors, 3 on each side. She tried each handle. The first 2 rooms opened into small bedrooms, each with an iron bed frame, a washstand, and a narrow wardrobe. Under the bed in the first room, she found a leather suitcase with the initials D stitched into the clasp. Inside, 3 cotton dresses, a pair of reading glasses, and a Bible with passages underlined in pencil. Under the bed in the second room, a wooden box containing a man's shaving kit, a discharge letter from the United States Army dated 1953, and a photograph of a young man standing beside a woman outside a church. The third door was locked from the outside. So was the fourth, and the fifth. Marta went back downstairs. In the front parlor, behind a water-stained curtain, she found a roll-top desk. Inside were stacked ledgers, postcards, and loose pages covered in careful handwriting. She sat on the floor and began to read. The boarding house had been opened by Hazel Timmons in 1961 as a place for people who had nowhere else to go. Widows arriving in town after losing their husbands in mining accidents. Single mothers who had been turned away from other rooming houses. Men returning from Korea and Vietnam who needed a quiet room and a locked door and no questions asked. Traveling teachers who came to the county for one-year placements and needed clean sheets and a warm meal. The ledgers showed room assignments, monthly payments, some in cash, some in labor, some listed simply as deferred. One entry, dated June 1974, read, Mrs. Ruth Ames and daughter, age 3, arrived with nothing. Room 6, no payment required. Duration, as long as needed. Another, from 1968. Agnes Pearl, seamstress, widowed, referred by Pastor Collins. Room 2. payment, mending, and laundry for all residents. Marta sat on that dusty floor for 3 hours, reading name after name, story after story. Women who arrived with one suitcase and stayed for years. Men who came broken and left standing. Children who grew up in these rooms and went on to lives that would never have existed without this address. She closed the last ledger and looked around the room. The water stains on the ceiling, the cracks in the plaster, the faded wallpaper with its pattern of small blue flowers. For the first time in 40 years, Marta Backwood felt something ignite in her chest. Not grief, not anger, not resignation. Purpose. Raw, stubborn, inconvenient purpose. She was not going to sell this house. She was going to save it. The restoration began the next week, and it began badly. Marta had $11,000 in her savings account and no experience with construction, plumbing, or electrical work. She hired a local contractor to assess the foundation, and he looked at her the way you might look at someone who had just announced they were going to swim across the Atlantic. "Ma'am," he said, "this building needs $60,000 minimum just to make it safe to stand in." She did not have $60,000. She had determination, a library card, and the Subaru. She started with what she could do herself. She swept every room. She scrubbed every floor on her hands and knees. She pulled the boards off the windows and let the light in for the first time in years. She filled garbage bags with debris and carried them down 3 flights of stairs, one at a time, her back screaming, her hands raw. The town watched with curiosity, then with skepticism. Then the opposition arrived. A man named Garrett Holloway, a real estate developer from Richmond who had been quietly buying properties along the river, came to see her on a Tuesday morning. He wore a charcoal suit and a smile that had been practiced in mirrors. "Mrs. Backwood, I understand you've inherited this property. Congratulations. I'd like to make you an offer. $210,000. Cash. I'll handle the taxes, the demolition, everything." "Demolition?" Marta said. "Luxury riverside apartments," Holloway said. "This location is prime. I've already got the permits for the adjacent lot. This parcel completes the project." Marta looked at him. She thought about the ledger entry for Ruth Ames and her 3-year-old daughter. She thought about Agnes Pearl, who paid her rent in mending and laundry. "No," she said. Holloway's smile tightened. "Mrs. Backwood, I don't think you understand your position. This building is a liability. The county inspector has already flagged it. If it's condemned, you'll get nothing." "Then I'd better fix it before that happens," Marta said, and closed the door. The county inspector arrived 2 days later. A man named Dale Ferris, who worked in the town planning office and who, Marta would later learn, had dinner with Garrett Holloway every other Thursday. Ferris walked through the building with a clipboard, marking violations, exposed wiring, missing handrails, water damage in the basement. He handed Marta a list of 37 code deficiencies and gave her 90 days to address them. 90 days, $11,000, 37 violations, and a 67-year-old woman who had never held a power drill. But something had shifted in Marta, something geological, something that had been building pressure for decades. She was not the same woman who had silently served Gerald's dinner parties. She was not the same woman who had packed her life into the Subaru and driven away without crying. She was the woman who had sat on a dusty floor reading about Agnes Pearl and Ruth Ames, and who had felt, for the first time in her adult life, that something truly depended on her. Help came from unexpected places. Tom Navarro was a licensed electrician in his early 50s, quiet and precise, with careful hands and a habit of not meeting your eyes when he spoke. He came to the boarding house one evening after Marta had posted a notice at the hardware store asking for volunteer help. "I can do the wiring," he said, standing on the porch with his toolbox. "Evenings and weekends, no charge." Marta looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" Tom set down his toolbox and sat on the porch step. He told her, slowly and with difficulty, that he had been estranged from his daughter for 3 years. He had made mistakes, missed her school plays, worked through her graduation, let the bottle get between them during the worst of it. He had been sober for 14 months, but his daughter still would not return his calls. "I need to be building something," he said. "Something that matters. Maybe if she sees that I can show up for something, she'll believe I can show up for her." He started the next day. Then came Nina Okafor, a 29-year-old woman from Norfolk who arrived in Greywater with a folder of photocopied documents and a question. Had anyone named Dolores Okafor ever lived in this building? Marta took her upstairs. Room 2. The suitcase with the initials DM was not Dolores, but the ledger entries led them to room 5, one of the locked rooms. Tom removed the padlock, and inside they found a narrow bed, a crocheted blanket, and a stack of letters tied with kitchen string. The letters were from a woman named Dolores Okafor to her sister in Lagos, describing her arrival in Greywater in 1972, her work at the local cannery, the room Hazel Timmons had given her, the kindness of strangers in a town where she knew no one. Nina sat on the bed and wept. Her grandmother had never spoken about her first years in America. The family had always assumed she had arrived with nothing and suffered in silence. But she had not suffered in silence. She had been held. She had been sheltered. She had been given a room with a crocheted blanket and a door that locked from the inside. Nina stayed for 2 weeks. She cleaned and painted and organized the archives. She cataloged every name, every entry, every scrap of paper. She built a timeline of the boarding house's residents that stretched from 1961 to 1997, 36 years of sheltering people in transit. And then there was Arthur Penniman. Arthur was 81, a retired tailor who lived in a small house on the other side of the river. He walked to the boarding house one morning with his cane and his hat and stood in the entrance hall for a long time, looking at the brass hooks on the wall. "I lived here," he said. 1965 to 1969. My mother and I. Room 3. Room 3 was one of the locked rooms. Tom opened it. Arthur stood in the doorway and did not move for several minutes. The bed frame was still there. The wardrobe, a small wooden stool by the window. "My mother sewed curtains for every room in this house," Arthur said. Hazel paid her in, room and board. We never had money, but we always had a place. Arthur began coming every day. He could not climb ladders or carry lumber, but he could sew. He made curtains for every restored room. The same pattern his mother had used, simple cotton with a 1-inch hem, each set a different color. Room by room, the boarding house came back to life. Tom rewired the second floor in 3 weekends, pulling copper wire through walls that had not been opened since the Eisenhower administration. He replaced every outlet, every switch plate, every junction box. He tested each circuit twice and labeled every breaker in the panel with a strip of masking tape and his careful, blocky handwriting. Nina painted the hallway, 3 coats of warm white over the old wallpaper, and organized the parlor into a small archive with the ledgers preserved in plastic sleeves and the postcards mounted on a corkboard under glass. Arthur measured windows and cut fabric, his arthritic fingers still precise after 60 years of tailoring. He made curtains for every restored room, the same pattern his mother had used, simple cotton with a 1-inch hem, each set a different color: pale yellow for room 2, soft green for room 3, blue, the color of the river in early morning, for room 6. Marta coordinated everything. She managed the budget down to the last dollar, kept a running spreadsheet in a composition notebook, and made decisions she never would have been allowed to make in Gerald's house. Decisions about color and layout and purpose. She chose warm paint over cold. She chose solid wood over laminate. She chose to repair the original banister instead of replacing it, spending 2 days sanding and restaining it by hand, because the wood had been touched by every person who had ever climbed those stairs. She spent $700 on a new front door with a glass panel. Gerald would have said it was a waste. Marta said it was an invitation. One evening in late July, Marta sat on the porch steps with a cup of tea, her back aching, her hands stained with varnish. Tom was inside, finishing the wiring in room 4. Arthur had gone home for the day, leaving a stack of neatly folded curtains on the parlor table. The sun was going down over the river, and the air smelled like cut grass and warm wood and possibility. She thought about her senior thesis, the one she had written in 1978, about transitional housing for women in crisis. She remembered the statistic that had stayed with her for 48 years. A woman who has a stable address for 90 consecutive days is 3 times more likely to find permanent employment. She'd underlined it twice. She'd been a social worker once, not a practicing one, not a licensed one, not one that Gerald would have recognized. But she'd known, at 22, what mattered. She'd known that shelter was not just a roof. It was a foundation. And here she was, at 67, proving it. Garrett Holloway did not give up. He filed a complaint with the county, claiming the renovation was being done without proper permits. Dale Ferris returned with a stop work order. Marta spent 3 days at the county clerk's office, filing permits she had not known she needed, paying fees she could barely afford, filling out forms in triplicate. Some townspeople sided with Holloway. A woman at the diner told Marta, flat out, "Nobody cares about those old stories. Tear it down and let the man build his apartments. At least that brings jobs." A man at the hardware store said, "You're wasting your time, lady. That building should have been knocked down years ago." But others came forward. The pastor of the church on Main Street donated $200 and a box of cleaning supplies. The owner of the hardware store offered Marta a line of credit for materials. A retired plumber named Hank drove 40 minutes from the next county to fix the basement pipes for free, because his mother had once lived in a boarding house just like this one, in a town just like this one, and nobody had ever thanked the woman who ran it. By the end of summer, the boarding house had been transformed. The porch no longer sagged. The windows were clean. The front door, the one with the glass panel, caught the light every afternoon and threw small rainbows onto the entrance hall floor. Each room had been restored with care. Fresh paint, new mattresses, Arthur's curtains, and a small framed card on the bedside table bearing the name of the person who had once lived there. Room 2, Agnes Pearl, seamstress. Arrived 1968. Paid her rent in Mending. Room 5, Dolores Okafor, cannery worker. Arrived 1972. Wrote letters home every Sunday. Room 3, Clara Penniman and son Arthur. Arrived 1965. Made curtains for every room. Room 6, Ruth Ames and daughter. Arrived 1974. No payment required. Duration as long as needed. Garrett Holloway came one last time in October. He stood on the restored porch, his charcoal suit slightly less crisp than before, his smile entirely gone. His Riverside apartment project had stalled. Without the Elm Street parcel, the footprint was too small for the building he had promised his investors. He was not desperate, but he was irritated, and irritated men in expensive suits have a particular way of looking at women like Marta. "Name your price," he said. Marta stood in the doorway. Behind her, the entrance hall was warm with light. Arthur was sewing in the parlor. Tom was upstairs, installing a smoke detector, whistling something Marta did not recognize. Nina had gone back to Norfolk, but she had left her grandmother's letters in the archive, framed and labeled. "Mr. Holloway," Marta said, "this building is not for sale. It never was. Everything is for sale, Mrs. Backwood. Not this. This house held people together when nothing else would. Widows, mothers, soldiers, workers, people who had nowhere to go. And it's going to do that again." Holloway stared at her. "You're going to run a boarding house? At your age? With what money? With what experience?" Marta did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She had spent 38 years listening to men tell her what she could not do. She was finished listening. "Mr. Holloway, I have a degree in social work. I have 40 years of experience managing households, budgets, crises, and difficult people. I have an electrician, a tailor, and the names of every person who was ever sheltered under this roof. What I do not have is any interest in continuing this conversation." Holloway opened his mouth, closed it, and turned away. He walked down the steps, climbed into his car, and drove away from 14 Elm Street for the last time. Marta watched him go. She felt the porch boards beneath her feet, solid now, freshly nailed, able to hold weight. Tom came downstairs and stood beside her. "He gone?" "He's gone." Tom nodded. He looked out at the street, at the river beyond it, at the late afternoon light turning the trees gold. His daughter had called him 2 weeks ago. A short call, cautious, but a call. She had asked what he was working on. He told her about the boarding house, about the wiring, about the old woman who was rebuilding something nobody else thought was worth saving. There was a pause on the line, and then his daughter said, "That sounds like something worth doing, Dad." It was the first time in 3 years she'd called him Dad instead of Tom. He had stood in the parking lot of the hardware store afterward, holding the phone to his chest, unable to speak. He was learning that trust is rebuilt the same way houses are, one board at a time, one day at a time, with patience and without guarantees. "I think Hazel would have liked what you've done," Tom said. Marta shook her head. "Hazel did the hard part. She opened the doors. I'm just making sure they stay open." Transition Home opened on the first Saturday of November. There was no ceremony, no ribbon cutting, no speeches from officials or blessings from dignitaries. Just Marta, standing at the front door with the glass panel, a pot of coffee warming on the kitchen counter, and 6 rooms upstairs. Each one clean, each one named, each one ready. The first resident climbed the porch steps at 9:30 in the morning. A 53-year-old woman named Jean, recently divorced, carrying one bag and looking at the building the way Marta had looked at it 8 months ago, with exhaustion and doubt and the faintest, most fragile thread of hope. "Welcome," Marta said. "Your room is upstairs. Room 6. It's named for a woman named Ruth, who came here once, with her little girl and nothing else. She stayed as long as she needed." Jean looked at Marta. Her chin trembled. "How long can I stay?" she asked. Marta smiled. "As long as you need." Marta Backwood arrived in Graywater, Virginia, thinking she was saving a building. She thought she would patch the roof, fix the plumbing, sell the property, and finally have enough money to stop worrying about her future. Instead, she found a house full of interrupted lives, suitcases under beds, names on door frames, letters that had never been answered. She found Agnes and Dolores and Ruth and Clara and dozens of others whose stories had been quietly erased by time and indifference. And in saving their stories, she found something she had not had in 40 years. A reason to take up space in the world. If you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever been told that what you do does not count, that your contributions are proportionate to nothing, that you should downsize your life and be fine, then Marta's story is for you. Because here is what Marta learned at 67, standing on a porch she rebuilt with her own hands. You do not have to wait for permission to matter. You do not have to be young to begin. And sometimes the thing that saves you is not something you find. It is something you refuse to let go of. The boarding house at 14 Elm Street still stands at the end of a narrow road in a quiet river town. The porch is solid. The windows are clean. Arthur's curtains hang in every room, each set a different color. And on the front door, the one with the glass panel that throws rainbows in the afternoon light, there is a small brass plate that reads, "Everyone deserves a room with a door that locks from the inside." Because dreams do not age. And neither does the courage to shelter someone who has nowhere else to go. See you in the next story.